Waite had reproduced, incidentally. Not only had he sent that antiques dealer down the blue tunnel into the afterlife so long ago, he had also made possible the birth of an heir. By Darwinian standards, as both a murderer and a sire, he had done quite well, one would have to say. He became a sire when he was only 16 years old, the sexual prime of a human male a million years ago. He was still in Midland City, Ohio, and it was a hot July afternoon, and he was mowing the lawn of a fabulously well-to-do automobile dealer and owner of local fast food restaurants named Dwayne Hoover, who had a wife but no children. So Mr. Hoover was in Cincinnati on business, and Mrs. Hoover, whom Waite had never seen, although he had mowed the lawn many times, was in the house. She was a recluse because, as Waite had heard, she had a problem with alcohol and drugs prescribed by her doctor, and her big brain had simply become too erratic to be trusted in public. Waite was good-looking back then. His mother and father had also been good-looking. He was from a good-looking family. Despite the fact that it was so hot, Waite would not take off his shirt because he was so ashamed of all the scars he had from punishments inflicted by various foster parents. Later, when he was a prostitute on the island of Manhattan, his clients would find those scars, made by cigarettes and coat hangers and belt buckles and so on, very exciting. Waite was not looking for sexual opportunities. He had just about made up his mind to light out for Manhattan, and he did not want to do anything which might give the police an excuse for locking him up. He was well known to the police, who frequently questioned him about this or that burglary or whatever, although he had never committed an actual crime. The police were always watching him anyway. They would say to him things like, "Sooner or later, Sonny, you're going to make a big mistake." So Mrs. Hoover appeared in the front door in a skimpy bathing suit. There was a swimming pool out back. Her face was all rattled and addled, and her teeth were bad. But she still had a very beautiful figure. She asked him if he wouldn't like to come into the house, which was air-conditioned, and cool off with a glass of iced tea or lemonade. The next thing Waite knew, they were having sex in there, and she was saying they were two of a kind, both of them lost and kissing his scars and so on. Mrs. Hoover conceived and gave birth to a son 9 months later, which Mr. Hoover believed to be his own. It was a good-looking boy who would grow up to be a good dancer and very musical, just like Waite. Waite heard about the baby after he moved to Manhattan, but he could never consider it a relative. He would go years without thinking about it, and then his big brain would suddenly tell him, for no good reason, that somewhere in the world there was this young male walking around who wouldn't be in this world if it weren't for him. It would make him feel creepy. That was much too big a result for such a little accident. Why would he have wanted a son back then? It was the farthest thing from his mind. The sexual prime for human males today, incidentally, comes at the age of 6 or so. When a 6-year-old comes across a female in heat, there is no stopping him from engaging in sexual intercourse. And I pity him, because I can still remember what I was like when I was 16. It was hell to be that excited. Then, as now, orgasms gave no relief. 10 minutes after an orgasm, guess what? Nothing would do but that you have another one. And there was homework besides. God. A fantastic paragraph. I'm going to read that. Last two paragraphs again. The sexual prime for human males today, incidentally, comes at the age of 6 or so. When a 6-year-old comes across a female in heat, there is no stopping him from engaging in sexual intercourse. And I pity him, because I can still remember what I was like when I was 16. It was hell to be that excited. Then as now, orgasms gave no relief. 10 minutes after an orgasm, guess what? Nothing would do but that you have another one. And there was homework besides. These people on the Bahia de Darwin weren't uncomfortably hungry yet. Everybody's intestines, including those of Kazakh, were still wringing the last of the digestible molecules from what they had eaten the previous afternoon. Nobody was consuming parts of his or own body yet. The survival scheme of the Galapagos tortoises. The Cancabonos certainly knew what hunger was already. For the rest, it would be a discovery. And the only two people who had to keep their strength up and not just sleep all the time were Mary Hepburn and the captain. The Cancabono girls understood nothing about the ship or the ocean and could make no sense of anything that was said to them in any language but Cancabono. Hisako was catatonic. Selena was blind, and Waite was dying. That left only 2 people to steer the ship and care for weight. During the first night, those 2 would agree that Mary should steer during the daytime when the sun would tell her unambiguously which way was east, from which they were fleeing, and which way was west, where the supposed peace and plenty of Baltra lay, and the captain would navigate by the stars at night. Whoever wasn't steering would have to keep weight company and presumably would catch some sleep while doing so. These were certainly long watches to stand. Then again, this was to be a very brief ordeal since, according to the captain's calculations, Baltra was only about 40 hours from Guayaquil. If they had ever reached Baltra, which they never did, they would have found it devastated and depopulated by yet another air-mailed package of dagonite. Human beings were so prolific back then that conventional explosions like that had few, if any, long-term biological consequences, even at the end of protracted wars. There still seemed to be plenty of people around. Babies were always so plentiful that serious efforts to reduce the population by means of violence were doomed to failure. They no more left permanent injuries, except for the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, than did the Bahia de Darwin as it slit and roiled the trackless sea. It was humanity's ability to heal so quickly by means of babies which encouraged so many people to think of explosions as show business, as highly theatrical forms of self-expression and little more. He's a crazy motherfucker. What humanity was about to lose, though, except for one tiny colony on Santa Rosalia, was what the trackless sea could never lose so long as it was made of water: the ability to heal itself. The trackless sea. Jesus Christ. As far as humanity was concerned, all wounds were about to become very permanent, and high explosives weren't going to be a branch of show business anymore. Yes, and if humanity had continued to heal itself self-inflicted wounds by means of copulation, then the tale I have to tell about the Santa Rosalia colony would be a tragicomedy starring the vain and incompetent Captain Adolf von Kleist. It would have spanned months rather than a million years, since the colonists would never have become colonists. They would have been marooned persons who were noticed and rescued in a little while. Among them would have been a shamefaced captain solely responsible for their travail. After one night at sea, though, the captain was still able to believe that all was well. It would soon be time for Mary Hepburn to relieve him at the wheel, at which time he would give her these instructions: keep the sun over the stern all morning and over the bow all afternoon. And the captain saw as his most pressing task the earning of his passengers' respect. They had seen him at his very worst. By the time they docked at Baltra, he hoped they would have forgotten his drunkenness and would be telling one and all, that he had saved their lives. That was another thing people used to be able to do, which they can't do anymore: enjoy in their heads events which hadn't happened yet and which might never occur. My mother was good at that. Someday my father would stop writing science fiction and write something a whole lot of people wanted to read instead, and we would get a new house in a beautiful city and nice clothes and so on. She used to make me wonder why God had ever gone to all the trouble of creating reality. Quoth Mandarax, imagination is as good as many voyages, and how much cheaper? John William Curtis, 1824 to 1892. So there the captain was, half naked on the bridge of the Bahia de Darwin, but in his head he was on the island of Manhattan, where most of his money and many of his friends were anyway. He was going to get there somehow from Baltra and buy himself a nice apartment on Park Avenue, and the hell with Ecuador. Reality intruded now. A very real sun was coming up. There was one small trouble with the sun. The captain had imagined all night that he was sailing due west, which meant that the sun would be rising squarely astern. This particular sun, however, was astern all right, but also very much to starboard. So he turned the ship to port until the sun was where it was supposed to be. His big brain, which was responsible for the error he corrected, assured his soul that its mistake was minor and very recent, and it had happened because the stars were dimmed by dawn. His big brain wanted the respect of his soul as much as he wanted the respect of his passengers. His brain had a life of its own, and the time would come when he would actually try to fire it for having misled him. But that time was still 5 days away. He still trusted it when he went aft to learn how Willard Fleming was and to help Mary according to plan, move him into the shade of the gangway between the officers' cabins. I do not put a star before the name of Willard Fleming, since there wasn't really such an individual, so he couldn't die. And the captain was so uninterested in Mary Hepburn as a person that he did not even know her last name. He thought it was Kaplan, the name over the pocket of her war surplus fatigue blouse, which Waite was using for a pillow now. Waite believed her last name to be Kaplan, too, no matter how often she corrected him. During the night he had said to her, "You Jews sure are survivors." She had replied, "You're a survivor too, Willard." "Well," he had said, "I used to think I was one, Mrs. Kaplan. Now I'm not so sure. I guess everybody who isn't dead yet is a survivor." Now, she had said, "Let's talk about something pleasant. Let's talk about Baltra." But the blood supply to his brain must have been momentarily dependable then, because Waite had continued to follow this line of reasoning. He'd even given a dry little laugh. He'd said, "There are all these people bragging about how they're survivors as though that's something very special, but the only kind of person who can't say that is a corpse." There, she said. When the captain appeared before Mary and Waite after sunrise, Mary had just consented to marry Waite. He had worn her down. It was as though he had been begging for water all night, so that finally she was going to give him some. If he wanted betrothal so badly, and betrothal was all she had to give him, then she would give him some. She did not expect, however, to have to honor that pledge almost immediately, or perhaps ever. She certainly liked all he had told her about himself. During the night, he had discovered that she was a cross-country skiing enthusiast. He had responded warmly that he was never happier than when he was on skis, with the clean snow all around and the silence of the frozen lakes and forests. He had never been on skis in his life, but had once married and ruined the widow of the owner of the ski lodge in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. He courted her in the springtime and left her a pauper before the green leaves turned orange and yellow and red and brown. This wasn't a human being Mary was engaged to. She had a pastiche for a fiancé. Not that it mattered much what she was engaged to, her big brain told her, since they certainly couldn't get married before they got to Baltra, and Willard Fleming, if he was still alive, would have to go into intensive care immediately. There was plenty of time, she thought, for her to back out of the engagement. So it did not seem a particularly serious matter when Waite said to the captain, "I have the most wonderful news. Mrs. Kaplan is going to marry me. I am the luckiest man in the world." Fate now played a trick on Mary almost as quick and logical as my decapitation in the shipyard at Malmo. "You're in luck," said the captain. "As captain of this ship in international waters, I am legally entitled to marry you. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God," he began, and 2 minutes later, he had made Mary Kaplan and Willard Fleming man and wife.